How long have I been making YouTube videos for ye? 5 weeks? 2 days? Help me to recollect. The northerly wind is up. It chills me old sailor's bones. 'Twill be most foul, dirty weather on the sea tonight. On nights such as these, the dread emperor shakes his briny trident, summoning all manner of unspeakables from the deep. Slithering monsters so horrible, even the white sharks flee from them in terror. Those foolish enough to swim in these choppy waters might feel the barnacled fingers of cannibal merfolk brushing against their naked skin. On nights such as this, the sea spits out the souls of dead sailors, and it is said that widows ashore deep in grief, listening to the ocean gale lashing against their windows, might also hear the squelch, squelch, squelch of rotten rubber boots approaching their chamber door. Hark! Hark! Begone, ye sprites of the sea! Watery goblins, stay thy reaching tentacled appendages. There is but one remedy to keep such evil enchantment from a wiki's house. Stories and drink. So sit ye down and allow me to regale ye with the tale of how we Yankees conquered the 7 seas. It'll be a long one. Drink up. When the Pilgrim Fathers first arrived at these shores, they found they had no skill at agriculture. Aye, even if they did, the shores of our Yankee coasts are bony, briny things, not suited to farming. But there was gold just offshore. Salmon, bluefish, flounder, cod, and the mighty breechin' whale. And for the enterprising men of the age, trade to the Indies too turned a tidy profit. So New Englanders set sail in their sloops and barks and pinnaces. So vital to colonial coffers was sea work that fisher folk and shipbuilders were exempt from the militia. Then as now 'twas dangerous work. Shallops were split on rocks, or set in harbors, lost in nor'easters, or simply swallowed up by the vast, unknowable, and unfeeling sea. Here's a seafaring tale for you. In 1637, a 30-ton pinnace bound from Boston to Bermuda was lost in a storm, driven far south to Hispaniola. Not daring to make berth in any civilized place, her crew camped in a dense jungle by the seashore, and lived off turtle flesh and hog meat ere setting sail for home. In her hold, the ship held a little souvenir from their tropical travels, a live alligator, which ended up being a real curiosity for the people of Boston. The beast was eventually given to the governor of Massachusetts Bay as a present. The fellow was named John Winthrop. Lord knows what he did with the beast. Hopefully he ate it. Come we now to the turn of the 18th century, and the coastal waters of New England no longer teemed with fish as they once did. But we Yankees have never been one to accept defeat, so we went further out, into the depths of the frigid North Atlantic. It was about this time that our intrepid Yankee sailors first fished the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland. But the one-masted vessels, once so beloved of Yankee sailors, would not do for this purpose. So pinnaces and sloops were replaced by ketches and schooners, the latter of which, by local legend, was invented right here on Cape Ann. Ha! 'Twas an ancient and venerable mariner of Gloucester who first devised a schooner rig for a 2-masted ketch. And as the proud vessel went off her stocks and cut through the waters of the harbour, a bystander shouted, "Look how she scoons!" And the ancient mariner at once replied, "Then a schooner shall she be!" Ha! It was a time of innovation, but also a war. The wars of Queen Anne and King William against the French and Indians up Canada way. French privateers mercilessly preyed on our noble Yankee fishing fleet. 'Twas a dark omen of things to come in future wars. But for now, the Yankee sailor thrived. Whaling in particular filled many a pocket with blubbery gold. Sperm whale oil made for a fine lubricant, and wax taken from the strange and unnatural organs within the creatures' heads could make the brightest, purest candles in all the world. The sailors came in all shapes, sizes, and colors. White men, black men, Wampanoag Indian men all set sail as Yankee whalers. One Captain Absalom Boston of Nantucket, who was himself half black and half Indian, helmed the Industry, A whaling ship with an all-black crew, black as the sea on the night of a new moon they were. On a 6-month voyage, Captain Boston returned with 70 barrels of whale oil and not a single man lost. 'Tweren't no fluke neither, for at the time a full fifth of Yankee sailors were black men. 'Twas a great irony to it though, for New Englanders at that time made a fortune off of the African slave trade. Rhode Island in particular was so dependent on it that even after 1808, when the slave trade was officially abolished, it barely abated in that state. Such vast fortunes rarely go unenvied for long, and after a few more wars with the French and the Indians, the Parliament across the pond, our colonial overlords, decided that we weren't pulling our weight in the empire. Mad King George delivered outrage after outrage to the colonies. Sugar Acts, Stamp Acts, Tea Acts. The Brits were determined to squeeze every last penny out of us, with nothing left to give our wives and children. And when we dared stand up like men, the Mad King sent his redcoats to occupy Boston. The indignity, the greed! There was nothing left for it. The bonds between us and that wretched European island would have to be permanently and totally dissolved. For it... Soft you now. Hark! Hear that? The fife and drum of a British regiment. I have heard stories, though I dared not believe them, of the spirits of redcoats that haunt these windswept shores. Aye, perhaps this ghostly music is just such an unholy visitation. Well, I won't stand for it. We thrashed the Brits in life, we can do it again in death. Begone ye! Limey sprites! I'm coming for ye!
What? This is your problem! Would that I had stayed in the old England, the proper one. What? Dunkin' Donuts is only coffee, don't you get it? It's not a big deal. The Patriots and Tom Brady, who cares? It's a game.
Watch your tongue, lad.
And on you go with that annoying voice of yours. You've been droning on, it sounds like for hours. This is ridiculous.
I have 2,700 subscribers, you lobsterback dog.
If you want to play the numbers game, then I have over 60,000. Look, I know how to make a proper historical documentary. You don't have to be so ridiculous as all this. Imagine someone putting on a silly voice just for views. It's utterly silly. Why don't you step aside a little bit? Maybe I can talk to the people a bit of a more appropriate style, on some sort of historical subject of interest.
May Neptune strike ye dead, Brandon!
Okay, that's nice. Just go, get out of here. Leave this to the professionals. Go.
Curse ye, Brandon, curse ye!
Strange, man. So, one of the most important things to understand about the New England coast is that, well, it's a very rocky kind of coast. This is not land which is very conducive to large plantation-style farming of cash crops, as you may find in, say, more southern American colonies. Now, because of this, the people of New England need to find a new way of not only surviving, but thriving. And while New England may not have much in the way of agricultural opportunities when compared to the South, it does have an awful lot of natural harbors and a very rich supply of fish. One of the first major industries that arose in the New England colonies is of fishing ships. And of course, when you have not a great deal many fishermen in the area, some of them happen to do very, very well. So well, in fact, maybe they can purchase a second fishing boat, and a third ship, a fourth ship. You have large fishing fleets arising in this area from very prominent men all up and down the coastline. Now, of course, as the years pass by, these fisher lords, if you will, sort of realize that there are new opportunities beyond simply, fishing. They begin converting their fishing fleets into mercantile fleets, shipping, merchants, commercial activity going up and down the coast, buying and selling as they go. We begin to see a new emphasis in New England on shipbuilding to support these mercantile fleets. We begin to see industries rise around them, all around the imports and exports being conducted along the area. And as well, of course, some of the most major trading partners for the New Englanders are not actually the English, whom normally they would just be exporting things like cash crops to, further south, but rather the New Englanders are trading with the Caribbean. They're trading with the southern colonies. They're importing things like molasses and sugar, of course, and they're exporting things like wood and, their shipbuilding expertise. They're just building ships for other people as well. All of this means that the actual, economy of New England is becoming more and more independent as it goes. It's becoming more and more self-sufficient and exceedingly rich in its own way. This is something that is not exactly conducive to an imperial relationship. The southern colonies, they're pretty good for Britain because they're exporting all those cash crops. The north, they're kind of doing their own thing, and that's not exactly the best. We need to find a way to generate new revenues from these rich New England colonies to actually make the presence there worthwhile. After all, they're very desirable areas and they're very expensive to maintain and defend. So we have being instituted by the British Parliament throughout the 18th century new forms of taxation on not exports but New England imports, New England goods being brought in to support their local industries. New Englanders are very, very invested in these sorts of things. And as the British Parliament is attempting to gain new revenues from them, we see how things like the molasses tax and the sugar taxes and other taxes besides end up. But we don't have to get into that very sad story now, I don't think, do we? Right, well, in any case, thank you all so very much for your time. Of course, humble and obedient servant of all that sort of thing. But I suppose we are technically on the other fellow's YouTube channel, so I should turn things back over to him. He's probably somewhere up there in that lighthouse. You'll see.
War! Glorious war! We won our independence! Aye, the revolution was a success, but not without its sacrifices. Ere the revolution, there were 360 Yankee vessels plying the waters of the Atlantic, north and south. But after Lexington and Concord, the dreaded British fleet blockaded our ports and blew our ships out of the water, sending them in pieces down to the dark depths wherein the Sea King holds his sulky court. But lo! The war was ours to win. The ports were opened. Aye, the British returned in 1812, but we beat 'em again. Sort of. Mark this, lads. After the wars, the Yankee mariner emerged out of the ashes stronger than ever, and determined not just to conquer the American coast, nor just the Atlantic, but each of the 7 seas. The golden age of the Yankee mariner had begun. Times were changing, the world was getting smaller, and the real money at sea lay far beyond our shores, to the distant corners of the world. There was good whaling to be had in the Barren Sea off Russian Alaska, trade to be made in the sunny South Pacific and the empires of the Orient, and exotic baubles to acquire in Africa and Spanish America. And we Yankee sailors were up to the challenge. For voyages lasting months or years, the simple schooner would no longer do. A new innovation was needed from the brightest of the Yankee shipbuilders. And so began the age of the Yankee whaling ship, a 3-masted beauty weighing 300 tons or more, and on her decks was the most vital tool of the whaling trade of the era, the try-work. Huge vats on the deck, set atop a blazing furnace to separate the whale oil from the blubber. The oil would rise to the surface, and the boys would cut it off and barrel it. This allowed the Yankee whaler to stay at sea for longer and hunt more whales, and turn blubber into gold. And thus New England became rich, and the beauteous Boston accent could be heard in every port around the globe. So it came to pass that New England Yankees conquered the world, not through feats of arms nor political intrigue. These are the tactics of landlubbers. No, only a foolish man regards the earth as those little bits of it that are covered in dirt. We Yankees know better. Through the sweat of our brows and the honest motive of feeding our families, our wives, and children at home, we took over each of the 7 seas in turn. Drink to that, lads. But alas, 'twasn't to last. Nothing does, after all. War, bloody accursed war, would once again keep New England ships in their berths. 'Twas not a foreign enemy this time, but our own brethren, the slavers of the Southern Confederacy. The rebel navy could not hope to contest us at sea, so like the British and the French before them, they went after our merchant vessels, privateering. Names like the CSS Shenandoah and CSS Alabama struck fear in Yankee hearts all around the world. And wherever they found Yankee sailors, they sank our proud vessels. But being gentlemen did not harm the crews, simply took them aboard ship, put them in a cell, and set them ashore at the next port they found. The Alabama met her fate in the summer of '64 off the coast of France, when she was cornered and sunk by a Yankee warship. And the cowardly captain of the Alabama threw his sword in the sea rather than surrender it to his enemy. And he escaped on a passing British steamer rather than going down with his ship like a man. The Shenandoah continued her depredations long after the war ended. She sank 28 Yankee whalers in the summer of '65, and her crew refused to believe that the Confederacy had lost. 'Twas not till November of '65 that the Shenandoah finally surrendered herself to the British in Liverpool. Her battle ensign was the final Confederate flag to be lowered in surrender. After the war, New England saw yet more change, and 'twasn't all good. In 1859, 2 Pennsylvanians dug the first truly profitable oil well. 'Tweren't long before petroleum replaced whale oil for good. Back home, the fires of industry were getting kindled. In just a few short years, New Bedford went from being the whaling capital of the world to almost entirely dependent on its textile mill. Slowly but surely, Yankee sailors turned their back on the sea and went to work in factories. The golden age of the Yankee mariner was over. But though whaling had gone the way of the dodo, the demand for fish had never abated, and there were thousands of New Englanders who were more than happy for the sea work. These were not Anglo-Saxon men, American-born. Oh no, these were the Irish immigrants and the Italians, coming off the boats in their thousands to all the great ports in New England. The Anglos did their damnedest to keep them out, but as any New Englander will tell you, 'twas in vain. Before you could say Viva San Pietro, the Cape Ann fishing crews were mostly made up of pole-walking Sicilians. Not to say that these immigrants had many privileges. The Yankee sailor was just as poor as he'd ever been. This was the Gilded Age, after all, when a few fancy rich folks had all the cash and everyone else had to make do with their scraps. They were industrialist types. Carnegies, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, what have you. And wouldn't you know it, those Carnegies, Rockefellers, and Vanderbilts got it into their heads that the coasts of New England would be the perfect place for their garish summer mansions. And so began the most dreadful blight that the ports of New England have ever seen. The summer people. Aye, the summer people who go to sea for pleasure. I'd just as soon go to hell for a pastime. But 'tweren't just the temperate white sand beaches and the jagged beauty of our coasts that drew the summer people here. 'Twas also a romantic ideal. The seafaring New Englander, that hardy, coarse, working Yankee man, had entered into the American imagination. But 'tis only half true. Look ye now at the countenance of the famous Gloucester fisherman, dauntlessly facing his imminent watery death. It ain't the face of the Pilgrim Fathers who settled this land, nor of the fisher lords of colonial days, nor even of the liquored-up Sicilians tumbling into the harbor to a spray of grease. 'Tis a fine monument, make no mistake, but it depicts a legend, a storybook hero, just this close from a parody. Not a real, breathing, living human man. But perhaps we're right to think of the Yankee mariner as something more than human. 'Twas dangerous work, as I said ere. Still is these days. And the steely glare of the Gloucester fisherman is only half the tale. Just a spitting distance away from that same monument are a series of plaques, inscribed upon which are the names of Gloucester men who died at sea. Hark you now. Merrill H. Adams, Oscar W. Alden, Michael Allen, Charles Anderson, Christian Anderson, John Anderson, Martin Anderson, William Anderson, John Atwood, Antoine Avini, William H. Bartlett, John Batson, Neil Beaton, John Benson, Charles Berg, John Black, Bertram Blake, Ronald D. Blodgett, Joseph Boone, John Boudreau, James Bowie, James M. Boynton, William Brown, James Burns, Ariel P. Burnham, Bolas Bushy, James Bushy, Lewis Caliste, James Caldwell, Charles Campbell, Everett Campbell, Conrad Carlson, Richard Carroll, William Carter, Joseph Chisholm, Lorenzo Shute, William Shute, Charles Claherty, John Clancy, Jackson Clark, Alexander Coggill, Nicholas Kohlberg, Thomas Connell, John Colin, Charles Crawler, Andrew Crowell, Augustus Crowell, Fred Crowell, James Daigle, Thomas Davidson, Benjamin DeCoste, William DeRoy, Philip DeVoe, Michael Donahue, John Drury, James F. Dunton, Reuben H. Ellis, Joseph Hanos, Frank Ferris, William Fisher, Elias Fladden, Frank Flake, Patrick Foley, Charles Fox, William Fraser, Garrett Galvin, John Garvey, Charles Gill, Alexander Girior, Edward Gordon, David B. Gorman, Joseph Goslin, John Cralvin, Samuel Grassi, John Greaves, George Gray, Frederick Hall, David Hogan, Martin Hogan, John H. Hokinson, John H. Holmes, John A. Howard, George Humpson, Charles W. Hunt, Richard Hurley, Charles Abey, John J. Ingersoll, Ralph Erling, Edward F. Jameson, Peter Jennison, Olaf Jensen, John Teraway, Andrew Johnson, Charles Johnson, Christian Johnson, Henry Johnson, Martin Johnson, David Jones, Fred Kennison, Joseph King, Frederick J. Knowles, Edward Landry, George W. Lane, Joseph M. Lane, John Lawrence, Benjamin Levange, Edward Levange, Carl Lewow, James Lockwood, William T. Long, Julius Magnuson, Peter Masson, George Major, George Matthews, Joseph McCassell, John MacLeod, Malcolm MacLeod, Hugh McCormick, Alan MacDonald, Andrew MacDonald, Angus MacDonald, Daniel MacDonald, James MacDonald, John MacDonald, Joseph MacDonald, Neil MacDonald, Robert MacDonald, Ronald MacDonald, William MacDonald, Daniel MacDougall, Archibald McEachern, John McGuire, Michael McInnes, Robert McInnes, Duncan McIsaac, John McIsaac, Michael McIsaac, Daniel McKay, John McKay, Alexander Mackenzie, John McKinnon, Peter McKinnon, Daniel McLeod, Alexander McMaster, William McMaster, John McNair, William Merchant, George Mills, August Mitchell, Lyman H. Morey, Daniel D. Morrison, David Morrison, Michael Muldoon, Charles Myers, Clarence Myers, Elkanah Nissan, Adolph Nelson, Frank Nelson, William Nelson, Charles Netherwood, William Nickerson, Frank Nolan, Samuel Nordahl, Joseph Nolan, Fitz E. Oates, Alan O'Brien, Patrick O'Brien, Andrew Olson, Charles S. Olson, Christian Olson, John Olson, Axel Olson, Michael O'Malley, Frank Oscar, George Perkins, A.W. Peterson, August Peterson, Peter Peterson, George Pooler, Theophilus V. Porter, James Powers, James Publicover, John H. Reynolds, Robert Reynolds, Seward Reynolds, Morris Riley, James Roberts, Joseph Rogers, George Ryan, John Ryan, Gordon Scott, Joseph Scott, Samuel Shano, William W. Sheldon, Edward Sherman, John Sherman, Frank Silva, John Smith, Joseph Smith, Manuel Smith, Martin Soderstrom, John B. Spanks, George C. Stearns, John Steele, Roderick Steele, F.H. Stimson, Martin Strahan, Patrick Sullivan, Andrew Swinson, John Tarr, Daniel Tatton, Paul Thibodeau, Ambrose Thibodeau, Dennis Thelming, Clifton Thompson, Lewis Thompson, David B. Tinker, James Tobin, John Tobin, Michael Tobin, Richard Tobin, Edward P. Townsend, Peter Trumbull, Frank Vanu, Philip Vibert, Edward Walton, Charles Watson, John Welsh, Samuel West, Charles White, Frank White, James White, Joseph White, George Whitman, John J. Williams, Thomas Williams, William Willoughby, Charles Wilson, John Wilson, William C. Wilson, Oscar Wister, George Yates, Cyrus Young, and 5 more unknown sailors. Those are the Gloucester men who died at sea in just the year 1879. Most of those men were lost in a single freak storm. Speaking of, do you hear that? Poseidon shakes his trident in the deep. The storm is come! Be gone with thee, enchantment! The lighthouse will hold! Be gone, ye! Come! Come, monsters! I'm ready for ye!
We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar all on the salt seas until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, it's 35 leagues.